I once heard a minister say at the close of worship as he blessed the congregation for the week ahead, he said, "Remember, behind every face you meet, there is a soul at work." And you know, we could call that the Cole's Note version of our reading from Matthew today. In these verses, we learn that blessed are those who fed the hungry, gave the thirsty something to drink, welcomed the stranger, took care of the ill, and visited the prisoner. In their kindnesses, they ministered to Christ himself. Cursed are those who did not, who turned their back on Christ in the guise of the needy. There is a lot of repetition in the text. 4 times Jesus says, "When did we see you naked," etc. This repeated litany suggests that this was something that needed to be heard over and over again. Jesus was not relating a parable. This was a teaching discourse. It takes me back to high school when occasionally the teacher would advise, "Make sure you get this part because it's definitely going to be on the exam." When each and every person is made in the image of God, it is that better part of ourselves that drives us to action, to encourage, to support, and to build up others. It is God's image in us shining through. Each time we deliberately ignore another person who we know to be in need, we not only refuse to allow God's image to shine through our own actions, but we also tragically fail to recognize the image of God in that other person. Jesus' condemnation of those who did not reach out to people in need is not just a condemnation of their actions, bad as those were, it is also about the effect that that behavior had on others. There is the sense in the reading that those who ministered to the needy encouraged others to stretch out a helping hand. It was contagious compassion. Our actions change others for good or bad, not just those we might help, but those who witness our reaching out or holding back. Just think back to the 1980s when the AIDS disease became known. Do you remember the stigma attached to that disease? And do you also remember the press coverage that Princess Diana generated when she simply shook hands with an AIDS patient? The photograph of Diana shaking the hand of that person without gloves on was flashed all around the world. At the time, many believed incorrectly that you could catch HIV through touch, due to the false reports about how it was spread. Her actions were revolutionary in convincing the public that there was nothing to be afraid of. That was a story being told very much in the spirit of "a picture paints 1,000 words." Coming forward into the 21st century, we now recognize that through social networking sites, people can be incited to all manner of actions. Sadly, evil can become normalized and people can become emboldened to behave badly towards their fellow human beings. But the same is true of positive forces. People can be swept along and encouraged to perform helpful acts and make a difference in their communities because of the example of others. I see this as a reminder of the power of storytelling. Just a few weeks ago, we observed Remembrance Sunday, and the faith community that I was with on that day took time to share stories of ordinary people and how they were affected by wartime. One of the stories that I shared was about my father's wartime experience as a boy living in the English countryside. My father was the youngest in his family. His father was the gardener of a big estate, but had died just before the war started. He didn't speak about that too much, but what he did recount was how when the U.S. joined the war in 1942, the U.S. Air Force dug up the farmer's field at the bottom of their garden, seemingly overnight, and laid a runway. This was for a bomber group to use. My father chuckled when he told the story that the Americans were feeding the local children. Britain was living with food rationing. I'm not sure if this was done regularly or just on some special occasions. Anyway, my dad said he was going along the line and the cook was serving food onto his plate. When he got to the end, he was asked, "Would you like ice cream?" Of course, Dad said, "Yes, please." And the server said, "Well, you better have it now then," and dolloped it onto the same plate as the meat and potatoes. I think the kitchen crew wanted to make sure that the children got their ice cream before it ran out. Just think of the ordinary people involved in this scene. School children being fed a meal which included ice cream, which would have been a rare treat in those days. The cooks and kitchen crew were far from home. My father remembered their kind actions so well 60 years later. The simplest of things can mean so much. All of us have been at the receiving end of good deeds, and the impact on us is often something that we will remember for a long time. It's something that we may talk about, a story we may tell. Most of us are familiar with the concept of pay it forward. Perhaps like me, you really got to understand it by watching the film Pay It Forward, which came out in 2000. I've learned that the concept goes back a lot further than that. It can be traced all the way back to a play that was first written and performed in ancient Athens in 317 BC. It was called Dyskolos, which translated means the grouch. Since that time, there have been numerous others, such as Benjamin Franklin, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Woody Hayes, who have used the idea in their writings, teachings, or coaching. Most of these references were made regarding the idea of money and lending of funds to be paid forward rather than being paid back. In the novel and movie Pay It Forward, the idea is that there is an obligation to do 3 good deeds for others in response to a good deed that one receives. Such good deeds should accomplish things that the other person cannot accomplish on their own. In this way, the practice of helping one another can spread geometrically through society at a ratio of 3-to-1, creating a social movement with an impact of making the world a better place. One of the wonderful parts of the Pay It Forward concept is the recognition of the recipient being a soul at work, worthy of respect, and a tacit acknowledgement that their present circumstances are not set in stone and that in the future they too will be able to help others. A wonderful example of this in recent years was through the work of the local interchurch refugee group, and I know some of you will be familiar with their work. They generally sponsor one family group at a time with all the support that settling in process requires. What started to happen was that the family that had just been settled wanted to help the next family that were to be sponsored. Our faith tells us that God is in the humanity and the humane actions of ordinary people. God is at work through us. We are God's hands and feet on earth. Years from now, we will have stories told about us. There will be stories about the impact we had on someone's life that we will never know about. Just like my dad's story of being served by men far from home in an American mess hall in rural England. There will be stories to pass on. And the storytelling is important work. It's part of how we grieve together, how we lament, but also how we encourage and inspire each other. My friends, it seems to me that wonderful stories come when ordinary people live through extraordinary times. Just think of the stories that we will tell about these pandemic times. The phone calls and emails from someone just checking in on us, delivering groceries and making masks for each other. I suggest that it's important to remember that the work we do and the stories we tell as individuals and as faith communities is noted and has a positive impact on the communities that we are part of. Within and beyond our faith communities, we are called to show kindness. This is worth celebrating because that is how we live out the image of God in us. And always remembering that behind every face you meet, there is a soul at work. May it be so.